I need to tell you something that made me physically sick when I read these court documents yesterday. In my 27 years analyzing corruption patterns at CIA, I thought I'd seen every form of institutional manipulation and financial exploitation imaginable. But what's happening in the Idaho murders case represents something so fundamentally corrupt, so morally bankrupt that it challenges everything I believed about our justice system's capacity for accountability. The families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin deserve justice. They deserve our support. They deserve compensation for their unimaginable losses. But what they don't deserve is to be used as pawns in a prosecutorial scheme that exploits both their tragedy and public generosity for institutional gain. Let me explain what I discovered buried in these court filings, because this isn't just about one case. This is about a pattern of behavior that reveals how our legal institutions operate when they think nobody's watching, when they believe the public's emotional investment will shield them from scrutiny. Brian Kohberger will spend 4 consecutive life sentences plus 10 years in prison. He will die behind bars. Justice has been served in terms of punishment. But now we're witnessing something that has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with institutional greed disguised as victim advocacy. Here's what happened, and I want you to understand this timeline because it exposes the systematic nature of this manipulation. After the murders, generous Americans across the country opened their hearts and wallets to help these grieving families. Multiple GoFundMe campaigns raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, including substantial amounts specifically designated for travel and accommodation expenses so family members could attend court proceedings. The American people, in their compassion, essentially said to these families, "You shouldn't have to worry about money while seeking justice for your children. We've got you covered." And they did. The GoFundMe campaign specifically asked for and covered travel expenses, hotel costs, everything these families needed to participate in the legal process. But here's where my intelligence background becomes crucial for understanding what's really happening. The Latah County Prosecutor's Office, not content with the plea agreement they negotiated, is now demanding that Kohberger pay approximately $20,000 to the Goncalves family and $7,000 to Madison Mogen's mother for the exact same travel and accommodation expenses that were already covered by charitable donations. Read that again. The same expenses, covered twice, once by generous Americans through GoFundMe, and now again through criminal restitution from Kohberger. This isn't just double dipping. This is systematic exploitation of both victim families and public generosity using the criminal justice system as the collection mechanism. In intelligence analysis, we call this institutional capture, when organizations designed to serve the public good become vehicles for advancing institutional interests at public expense. What I'm seeing in these court documents is a prosecutor's office that has lost sight of what restitution is actually supposed to accomplish and has instead weaponized it for financial engineering. Let me break down their legal strategy because it reveals sophistication that should alarm every American who cares about institutional integrity. Under Idaho law, restitution orders can be converted into permanent civil judgments. Once recorded, these become financial liens against the defendant that can be enforced indefinitely, regardless of their ability to pay. The prosecution isn't just seeking compensation for the families, they're creating permanent financial claims against any money Kohberger might receive for the rest of his life. They've been monitoring every penny deposited into his jail accounts, tracking who sends him money, building a financial surveillance apparatus around a man who will never leave prison. But here's what really exposes their agenda. The prosecution explicitly states they're worried Kohberger might profit from his notoriety through book deals, media interviews, or cooperation with researchers. They reference Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychologist who previously expressed interest in telling Kohberger's story. and they want these restitution orders in place to capture any potential income. That's not victim compensation, that's financial speculation. They're gambling that Kohberger might someday make money from his crimes, and they want to position themselves to seize it. The problem is they're using inflated restitution amounts based on expenses that have already been covered to justify these civil judgments. This reminds me of patterns I witnessed when analyzing how authoritarian regimes use legal systems to advance institutional goals rather than deliver justice. You start with a legitimate purpose, compensating victims, then gradually expand the mechanism until it serves institutional rather than public interests. The most disturbing aspect of this scheme is how it exploits the family's grief. These aren't wealthy people trying to game the system. These are grieving parents who lost their children in the most horrific way imaginable. They're not the ones filing motions demanding double payment. The prosecutors are. The families receive community support because Americans wanted to help them through an impossible situation. Now, prosecutors are arguing that charitable donations don't count as actual payments because the donors weren't legally obligated to help. Therefore, according to their logic, the families can keep the GoFundMe money and collect the same expenses again from Kohberger. That's not legal reasoning. That's legal manipulation designed to circumvent the obvious moral problem with charging someone twice for the same expense. Let me explain why this matters beyond this specific case. The prosecution is relying on State versus Cheney, a 2007 Idaho Supreme Court case, to argue that voluntary charitable donations shouldn't reduce restitution obligations. But they're misapplying that precedent in ways that should terrify anyone who understands how legal precedents work. Cheney was about preventing defendants from escaping restitution obligations just because victims had insurance or other legal remedies available. It wasn't about allowing victims to collect the same expenses multiple times from different sources. The purpose of restitution is to make victims whole, not to create windfall profits for expenses already covered. But the prosecution is trying to establish a precedent that charitable donations are legally irrelevant to restitution calculations. Think about the implications. If they succeed, anytime there's a high-profile crime that generates public sympathy and charitable giving, prosecutors could argue that defendants still owe full restitution, regardless of how much money victims receive through donations. That would essentially penalize public generosity and incentivize prosecutors to seek maximum restitution amounts, knowing that charitable giving provides additional compensation on top of legal awards. This isn't just bad policy, it's morally corrupt. It transforms the criminal justice system into a mechanism for extracting maximum financial penalties rather than achieving actual justice. What makes this particularly infuriating is the timing. The original plea agreement contemplated restitution for funeral expenses and crime victim compensation reimbursement. Travel and accommodation expenses weren't explicitly included. But then, after sentencing, the state discovered that crime victim compensation wouldn't cover travel expenses, so they pivoted. They essentially said, well, we thought this state program would pay for travel costs, but they won't, so now Kohberger has to pay instead. That's called changing the deal after the fact. When you negotiate a plea agreement, both sides are bound by its terms. You don't get to expand the scope of restitution after sentencing just because your initial assumptions were wrong. The defense attorneys, Ann Taylor, Elisa Massoth, and Becca Barlow, have made exactly this argument. They've pointed out that the plea agreement specified funeral expenses and crime victim compensation reimbursement, not general travel expenses. They've documented that the families received GoFundMe donations specifically for travel costs. They've argued that ordering payment for expenses already covered amounts to double recovery. This isn't a frivolous defense strategy. This is sound legal reasoning that should be compelling to any judge who cares about contract interpretation and basic fairness. But here's what really keeps me awake about this case. The prosecution has attached exhibits showing Kohberger's jail account transactions, documenting every financial contribution he's received while incarcerated. They're conducting comprehensive financial surveillance on a man who will never leave prison and using that surveillance to justify permanent financial liens. If the government can monitor every penny Kohberger receives and seize it based on inflated restitution orders, who else are they monitoring? What level of financial surveillance are they conducting on other defendants? How are they using that information? We live in an age where every financial transaction leaves a digital footprint. The technology exists to monitor anyone's financial activity in real time. The prosecution's strategy in this case reveals how that technology can be weaponized through the criminal justice system. They're essentially arguing, we're going to watch Kohberger's finances for the rest of his life, and any money he receives will be subject to seizure based on these civil judgments. That's not restitution. That's a financial surveillance state applied through criminal law. The broader implications should alarm anyone who cares about institutional accountability. If prosecutors can inflate restitution amounts beyond actual economic losses in order to create permanent financial liens, they've discovered a mechanism to impose additional punishment outside the sentencing process. Think about what this means for plea negotiations. Defendants might agree to specific prison sentences, believing they understand their total exposure, only to discover later that prosecutors are seeking inflated restitution that converts into permanent civil judgments. That fundamentally alters the risk-benefit calculation that informs plea decisions. It also creates perverse incentives for prosecutors. If restitution orders can be converted into permanent civil judgments, prosecutors have financial motivation to seek maximum amounts, regardless of actual victim losses. The higher the restitution, the larger the civil judgment, the greater the potential for future collections. That's not victim advocacy. That's institutional profit maximization using victim families as justification. What troubles me most as someone who spent decades analyzing institutional corruption is how this scheme exploits public sympathy to achieve prosecutorial goals. The families deserve support, compensation, and justice, but they also deserve honesty from the prosecutors supposedly representing their interests. Are these prosecutors telling the families that they're seeking duplicate compensation for expenses already covered by charitable donations? Are they explaining that this strategy is designed primarily to create permanent financial liens rather than address actual economic losses? Are they being transparent about their true objectives? My experience analyzing cover-ups and institutional deception suggests they're not. They're likely framing this as aggressive victim advocacy while concealing the financial engineering aspects that serve prosecutorial rather than victim interests. The most tragic aspect of this entire situation is that it undermines legitimate victim compensation efforts. When prosecutors manipulate restitution systems for institutional gain, they erode public trust in victim advocacy programs. People become skeptical of charitable giving when they realize donations might be used to justify additional collections rather than actually helping families. This case could establish precedents that damage victim compensation efforts across the country. If charitable giving becomes legally irrelevant to restitution calculations, donors might conclude their generosity enables rather than prevents additional financial exploitation. Looking ahead, this case will likely proceed through multiple court levels, possibly reaching the Idaho Supreme Court or even federal courts on constitutional grounds. The decisions made will influence how restitution is calculated nationwide, how charitable donations are treated in criminal cases, and what level of financial surveillance the government can conduct through criminal justice mechanisms. But beyond the legal implications, this case reveals something deeply troubling about institutional priorities within our justice system. when prosecutors use victim tragedies to advance institutional goals that have little to do with actual victim compensation, they've crossed a fundamental line between public service and institutional self-interest. Brian Kohberger is a convicted murderer who deserves no sympathy, but the precedents we set in cases involving unsympathetic defendants have implications for everyone who might someday interact with the criminal justice system. If prosecutors can manipulate restitution calculations, conduct comprehensive financial surveillance, and create permanent civil judgments based on inflated amounts, those powers won't remain limited to murder cases. The families of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan deserve justice. They deserve support. They deserve compensation for their real losses. What they don't deserve is to be used as cover for prosecutorial schemes that exploit both their tragedy and public generosity for institutional advantage. Until prosecutors demonstrate they're seeking actual victim compensation rather than maximum financial extraction, until they show transparency about their true objectives, until they honor the terms of plea agreements they negotiated, this isn't justice. This is institutional corruption disguised as victim advocacy. And that should alarm every American who believes our justice system should serve the public rather than institutional interests.